welcome you to the closing day of the Washington Jewish Music Festival. It's great to have you here for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. We have four wonderful panelists today. My name is Sarah Beller. I'm the festival director, and before we get started, I want to thank some of the sponsors that have made this festival possible, especially the Howard and Geraldine Pollinger Family Foundation, the United Jewish Endowment Fund, and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And for today's discussion, we have also special support from the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C., that supports the idea of looking into these issues of radio, the history of radio, and the future of radio. This discussion grew out of a conversation with Washington Post columnist Marc Fisher, who's with us today. And we wanted to take the opportunity not only to listen to music, but actually to think about the larger ideas of music and how it fits in with American culture, and use the tradition of inquiry and questioning and intellectual discovery that we know and love from our Jewish culture, and apply it to American culture and radio and music today. I want to encourage you, before you leave, to fill out a survey so we can know what you thought about today and we can keep in touch with you. And there'll also be a book signing and t-shirts for sale afterwards. So please welcome Marc Fisher, who will welcome our other panelists, and please be prepared to participate in today's discussion.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Sarah mentioned my other hat as a Washington Post reporter and columnist, and as the newspaper industry suffers through a decline very similar to what's going on in broadcast radio these days, everywhere I go, people say, well, do you have your exit strategy? Have you figured out what you're doing as newspapers are decreasing the size of their staffs at a rather dramatic pace? So I did come up with an exit strategy, and I wrote this book about radio, and so now I am firmly grounded in not one, not two, but three declining industries: newspapers, books, and radio. So that's all set. But I'm very encouraged to see a good crowd out today, and very thrilled to have this great panel of folks to talk about the future of radio and the future of music. We have with us Federal Communications Commissioner Jonathan Adelstein, who's been on the commission since 2002. Adelstein, I'm sorry, who before joining the FCC worked on the Hill, and for 15 years he was a staff member in the Senate. He was a senior aide to Tom Daschle, and had other positions before that as well. He's from Rapid City, South Dakota, and lives here in the Washington area with his wife and two children. Lee Abrams is the Chief Programming Officer of XM Satellite Radio, and in that position he is really the creative genius, the person who put together the 100 and nearly 200 channels of programming on satellite radio, this coming after a very long and extremely influential career in commercial broadcast radio, where he was the architect of a lot of the formats that came to dominate FM music radio in the 1970s and 80s, and went through quite an interesting journey, which we can talk to him about today, where he eventually came to, I think, soured on a fair amount of what he had been very instrumental in creating, and saw XM as a way to, I don't know if do penance would be too strong, but certainly to turn the corner back toward a very different kind of approach. And Harold Feld is the Senior Vice President of the Media Access Project, which is a nonprofit based here in Washington, where he focuses on internet law and communications policy, and a lot of the real cutting edge technological changes that we see are playing an enormous role in changing how we listen, what we listen to, and the shape of not only radio but so many other technologies. Harold is formerly worked at Covington and Burling, a big law firm here in town, and clerked for the DC Court of Appeals. So I wanted to start out with a quick quotation from a piece that Chuck Klosterman, who's a very interesting essayist for Esquire magazine, wrote a few weeks back, where he said, "Rock radio has never seemed less important than it does right now. suddenly the entire idea of radio seems like an insane, hopeless business model. A man you cannot see decides which song you're going to listen to based on nothing. Meanwhile, you mentally sign a social contract wherein you later agree to listen to another man's 30-second attempt to sell you a car. At this point, it's hard to imagine anyone deeply engaged with culture relying on radio. Well, that kind of doom and gloom commentary about radio is very much like what I found when I was researching this book, which traces radio from the moment in the early 1950s when television first became available to a majority of American homes. And for the first couple of years after that, the rhetoric in the trade press, in the popular press, in the radio industry was every bit as gloomy as what you hear today about broadcast radio, broadcast television, and print. And yet what happened, and the lesson that I drew from researching that period, is that old media really do not tend to die. They tend to evolve, and they tend to become, the landscape changes, and the purpose of those media will sometimes change. And in radio, what happened was the technological changes that came along hit at exactly the same moment that R&B and early rock and roll came along. And the combination freed a number of radio station owners, particularly in small markets, particularly in the Midwest, to break a lot of the rules, to break the taboos. At that time, it was simply not done. You did not play records on the radio, with the exception of a handful of hit parade kind of shows. The tradition and the rule, enforced very much by the musicians' unions, was that radio stations and networks hired their own big bands, their own orchestras, and most of the music you heard on the radio was live performed or on transcription, but it was not records the way we came to see it in the 50s and 60s. That changed because a handful of radio station owners were willing to break that taboo, along with the taboo that you did not play the same song on the radio more than once a month, which today seems preposterous, and yet it was a revolutionary step that some station owners took. Well, those kinds of innovations changed the face of radio, created an opportunity for radio station owners to focus their programming on one particular generation, which was something entirely new in the annals of popular culture. So as we turn to today, I wanted to start out by asking the panelists to talk a little bit about whether radio is indeed dying. Are we in a moment that is like 1951 when the technology is changing and therefore radio will be expressed in a very different way but will still exist? Or are we really seeing the end of broadcast radio? Lee, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think it's probably spend all afternoon on that one. But I think it's in terrible condition creatively, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But it really, I think, boils down to radio guys who operate the radio stations taking their eye off Main Street and really focusing on Wall Street. And there are reasons for all that. But sort of the domino effect of that goes right down to the DJs, where there's something called a creative batting average, where you come up with, if you work at a radio station, particularly in programming, the creative side, and you come up with 100 ideas, if 30 of them work, you're an all-star. You're batting 300. Nobody will remember the 70 that didn't. But what's happening at terrestrial radio, AM and FM, is nobody's taking any creative at-bats because they're scared to. And I've talked to people who come to XM and say, I had this idea, and before I could get a sentence out, the management of the station said, if it doesn't affect the revenue in the next 30 days, forget it, we don't want to hear this. And so there's this real creative dilemma, which is 180 degrees from what radio was back in the 50s, where it was all, you'd go to the competitor and steal their memos out of their trash cans in the back to find out what they're doing next, so you could do it better. So there's a real, at broadcast radio, a real creative dilemma. And it's tough because a lot of these companies paid so much money for these stations, can't afford to take any risk. And the real people who are suffering are listeners because, it's a risk-free kind of thing. And if you look at the playbook, the way radio, contemporary radio sounds, the way its architecture was developed, it was all in the as you mentioned, in the early 50s, is radio dead? No, let's fight back. We've got transistors, radios on our side. The birth of the 45 RPM record, Elvis and the Platters are happening. Top 40 radio was created, and it was totally just great. And so the playbook was written for contemporary radio. And then in the late 60s, in the middle of the drug revolution, sexual revolution, riots on the streets, moon landings, and the musical revolution that was happening, and the birth of stereo and all that, AM still was in that mid-50s playbook. And I actually went to a Jimi Hendrix concert in 1969, and it was introduced by the Pied Piper of teens, like Johnny Tiger or something, who 3 or 4 years earlier was a god in local media and all that. And went out there, and he was like a George Carlin bit. Hey everybody, having a great time, ready? Boo, get this jerk off. And people were throwing rocks at him. And it just symbolized how, with culture changing, AM was still living in that Leave It to Beaver playbook, black and white radio. Meanwhile, we're in a technicolor cultural revolution of the late 60s. So anyway, FM came along, and after about 30 years of being in the closet, playing dentist office music tapes, kind of mobilized itself and rewrote the playbook. Now you had FM, and 10 years later, FM just completely overtook AM. But now, in 2007, FM's making the same mistakes AM's making. It's a new environment with so many new choices, from the internet to iPods to cultural change, right and left out there, but are still relying on the playbook written in 1972. My favorite is, if you listen to radio stations, you'll hear ninth caller wins, whenever they give away a prize. Well, that was very cool in 1971 when touch-tone phones were introduced, and programmers thought, wow, let's do our contest based on how fast people can dial. It was 35 years ago. And that's just one part of how FM stations haven't changed or flexed with the culture. And the reason is they're restricted. They can't, the programmers are told, no, don't. Just stick with what you're doing as long as we're making our revenue numbers. And like a good programmer would say, wait a minute, it's a new world out there. We've got to, there's all this great music. No, just do what research is right and lowest common denominator, all that. So the short answer, your medium answer to your question is, I think radio, the idea of sound, theater of the mind, is timeless. It'll always be here. It's magical. The great American experience is driving down a freeway at 80 miles an hour, windows down, listening to a great song. No video, no cell phone, listening. So I think that experience will always be here. But from a creative standpoint, radio's doing everything it can to shoot itself in the foot to drive people away. Just one final point is, I have kids, the daughter 20, and her friends came over when they were on spring break. And I was doing a focus group trying to convince them to buy XM, get it from the car. And they just said, oh, radio stinks. We would never listen to it. Radio's horrible. Oh, do you listen to it? Well, if I have to, all that. And I was trying to explain, no, XM's different. None of that, no commercials, no, I call junk culture, dumbing down, stupid stuff, no games. But they were so conditioned to radio being bad because they started listening when they were 10 in, 1997 at the peak of consolidation and research-controlled playlists. Unlike me and probably the other guys and most people in the room, they never heard a great radio station. When I was growing up in Chicago, I remember 1962, I get chills when I think back to listening under the covers to WLS. It was magic. They never lived that. And one of the reasons XM's audience is skewed so old is because they remember radio can be great. Talk to a 20-year-old, radio? Why? I got my iPod. So anyway, I don't think it's dead, but I think terrestrial is helping itself die, but it still won't. Sorry.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Lee's saying, and would add to it. Mark's point about dinosaurs and the dinosaurs don't die. As we were talking a little bit before this, I was saying, a lot of people are saying now the trick isn't how we're going to kill the dinosaurs. The trick is how to get the dinosaurs to evolve into birds, and that's really the challenge for terrestrial radio. And I'll add, there are a number of bright spots in modern terrestrial radio, and they really depend on having a relationship with your listener. Understanding that this is not some kind of fungible product that you can test and market research. And how many people here, by the way, are familiar with something called central casting? Very few. One person is. This was the thing that was going to make the synergies of radio so amazing for Clear Channel and just shoot their profits through the roof, was the idea that you didn't even have to do local programming for your station anymore. You could have one guy in an office somewhere getting local news off of the internet and doing a general patter. And your local DJ was actually sitting in an office somewhere, and he'd be saying, "So, how are you out there this morning in?" And then a computer at the radio transmitter would go, "Insert name of city," and they would do all of this, sort of scripted stuff, and then they'd play the same songs that you'd be hearing everywhere else in the country. They'd be running the same kind of talk radio. Of course, half the time it was also because companies like Clear Channel own the syndication rights in this talk radio. If you're wondering why, it is that I can get, Rush Limbaugh everywhere, well, Clear Channel has a stake in that. And, unsurprisingly, whatever the personal political views of the people who run the company, as an economic matter, it's just cheaper for them to run that than to, pay for Air America programming in addition to, the stable of folks that they've already got. So they had this whole great economic thing worked out, except for one thing. They forgot that if nobody's actually listening to what you're playing, then you do not have a product anymore. You have a lot of, empty space that's being filled with junk that nobody cares about. And that has really been where radio has fallen down. And why people have been deserting in droves. Because the other thing, of course, that these guys didn't realize was competition to their signal was coming. They, to a certain degree, felt, and you can find this in a lot of the entertainment industry, that they were always going to have an audience because what else are you going to listen to? Well, it turned out there were other things coming along you could listen to. You could start after 1997 listening to satellite radio. You could listen to stuff that was coming through the internet for the first time. A lot of the times this listening experience was not quite as good. I don't know how many people here use internet radio. There are a lot of good things that I like to say about internet radio, and I enjoy it, but, it's not the same as my local radio station if my local radio station gave me what I wanted. It's not as portable. It's not something I can always get because our national broadband policy is so awful, but that's a different panel. There's a problem with my iPod. I love my iPod. I don't go anywhere without it, but I know everything that's on my iPod, and I've got like 2,000 songs on my iPod, and that's really great. And I put it on shuffle, and I have my own little radio station that's WFELD, and I'm listening to it, and that's great, except that I'm never going to get the experience of something new that way. So I think there's a lot to be said for terrestrial radio, and in some of the pockets where we have seen local radio that still works for people, especially the low-power FM service. People here are probably not at all familiar with this, but this was an amazing thing that the FCC did in 1999 that unfortunately Congress cut back on in 2000, and it's still out there and plugging away, is Congress created the opportunity, the FCC created the opportunity for these little radio stations that broadcast at 100 watts, so it gives you an area of about 5 or 6 miles. Mostly it's in rural areas of the country because that's where you could fit them into the holes in the radio broadcasting spectrum. But that's created an environment. If you go out to the Eastern Shore here, there's a local low-power FM station, and they do local Eastern Shore stuff because they're not part of this big conglomerate. They're a very localized medium. You can find a couple of examples of that in various places around the country, and where that's out there, you're getting people very interested because they're reconnecting with radio. So I don't think that radio is necessarily dead. I do think that they are at a what people like to call an inflection point. And one of the biggest changes that's going on right now is a financial change. We're seeing a lot of private equity firms coming in to buy up Clear Channel, break up these media companies, buy them up, and it's going to be very interesting to see in the next 4 or 5 years what strategy these equity firms pursue, whether they say, the mistake was not investing in music and formats for the audience, and we're going to spend 4 or 5 years where we don't have to worry about our quarterly profit reports and stock prices, building up audiences again, making radio stations more profitable again, and then we'll turn around and sell off these more profitable pieces and hope people have learned their lessons. Or are they going to be, as I like to say, like piranhas on a cow, and just sort of strip out whatever's left and basically reduce radio to traffic and weather, which frankly, if I had my way, the XMs and the Siriuses would be allowed to do. It'd be good to have some competition for terrestrial radio in that regard. But, we're going to see 4 or 5 years from now whether the companies that own these radio stations have learned that it's about audience and that they have to compete like everybody else by putting out a good product and one that people want to listen to, and that means investing in local programming that connects to people, or whether they're just going to keep trying to do this by cutting costs and chasing the synergy rainbow. In which case, I think 5 years from now, it's going to be very hard to find any profitable radio stations out there.
Commissioner?
Well, the forecast we heard from Esquire seemed a little bit Pollyannish to me, like the first chapters of your book where the rise of television made people believe that radio was dead, and in fact, it was going to enjoy quite a renaissance shortly thereafter. And I don't think we're on the border of a renaissance here, but as a member of the FCC, I'm not in the business. I'm in the business of regulating them. And so what I do see is the transactions that come through asking us for approval to transfer a license when people are selling them. The fact of the matter is, as Harold alluded to, there's a very vibrant market for these radio stations. And these Wall Street people are smart. I mean, they're not going to be investing in something that's dying unless it's just a monumental mistake, which people with that much money and brains generally don't make on this level. So the prices are holding fairly steady. You can pay hundreds of millions of dollars for a radio license. If it was an anachronism, I don't think that'd be happening. Now, Harold talked about private equity coming in. I think one of the reasons is that they do have something of a declining revenue, a real struggle in expanding the market. And even though they're making a huge amount of money, they're highly profitable. Cash cows. As a matter of fact, Les Moonves, who controls CBS, which owns CBS Radio, used to be Infinity, recently, I think in the last week or two, was quoted as saying what a fundamental part of their empire radio is, because it brings in $1 billion a year, cold hard cash. Just keeps pouring in. So anything that profitable and that widely used, with 200 million people a week listening someplace to radio, I don't think is anywhere near dead, but it is very sick. And I agree with everything that's been said by the other panelists. There's a real problem. I mean, the strength of radio is localism, and the warmth that comes from that, the community connection, which Mark's book so clearly elucidates. But the rise of consolidation and the corporatization of these stations, which we've talked about some, I think has really robbed a lot of the soul of radio. And for young people, one of the reasons you don't see increasing revenue, and it's hard for them to keep it, is that they do sense the loss of what it was that we all who are a little bit older recognize and love about radio. Partly Congress's fault for taking the cap off, and the fault of those who consolidated for not allowing the local control and forgetting about the importance of localism. They talk about localism, but they don't put the resources in and the community connection that there used to be that makes it possible. Now, one hopeful sign for the future coming out of the FCC, we're moving towards digital radio. We've approved a new technology that allows radio stations to move from analog to digital, which means that a station which is now broadcasting one signal can do 2 or 3 in the place of 1. On FM, it also raises the sound quality to CD quality, so it sounds like XM or Sirius quality of sound, and on AM, it's FM quality. So here's an opportunity, and it's now approved. The technology is available, and you can go buy the radios. The problem is not many people have bought the radios yet. You're probably not going to get a rapid uptake in them, but slowly but surely, there's 1 billion radios, I think, out there today. They're going to be replaced over time by radios that have the capacity to get these digital signals. So here's an upside for the radio industry, and the question is, what do they do with it? It's an opportunity. I can't get the FCC or the broadcasters to talk about public interest obligations. They won't even discuss it. Me and my colleague, Commissioner Copps, we're in the minority, 2 Democrats on a 5-member panel. Can't quite get that issue much focus, but hopefully the industry will recognize that here's an opportunity for localism. Instead of just taking the extra channels and reprogramming some national signal, if they really try to connect with niche audiences, they could sort of XMize themselves, if you will. They could come up with more targeted programming, and particularly things that respond to community needs that aren't now being met. I think nobody else can do that. Satellite radio can't do that. Nowhere else can you have that done. You talk about what's left when people prefer their iPods, but people, not all people, especially me, don't like to do their own programming. I mean, I love hearing new material. I do subscribe to satellite radio because I can't stand corporate radio anymore and what's happened to it. But I love my satellite radio. And the reason is I keep getting new material thrown at me, all kinds of new ideas. I might go out and buy some of it when I get it, and I can see, because it's digital, what it is. So that's wonderful. Somebody else is programming for me. If the radio industry is programming interesting material, and they have new opportunities now on digital to do that, I think people appreciate being exposed to new material. And if they broadcast real local content, that responds to community needs, there's nowhere else somebody can turn for that. They can't go anywhere but radio. So if they do it right, which they haven't been doing recently, then there is a possibility to turn it around somewhat, and that might be some of the upside that private equity is sensing.
There is, we've heard several people talk about what people in the industry call iPod fatigue, which is, you load up your iPod with thousands of songs, you listen to them a few times, and then a few months down the road, you pretty much stop listening to it because you know what's there. And even though it's more songs than you might be able to immediately summon to mind, the very fact that you know what's there dissuades you from listening, and so people begin to crave, where do I find out about new music? Where do I find out about new artists? And if we go back to that period in the early mid-50s when rock and roll was just beginning, radio did provide that sense of surprise. I just want to play you one thing that might give you a sense of what that felt like. I mean, this is immediately after the period when radio was dominated by the soap operas and the situation comedies and all of the kinds of programming that then migrated over to television. And in the middle of this vacuum that was left in radio, if you're sitting in Cleveland one night, you would hear something like this, if we can get this to work. Let's see. Tell me what to do here.
Let's see if we got volume on that.
That's what's
let's see
going
here.
So whenever the
it's
FCC
not
is
even-
around, there's always technological difficulties.
Right.
Let's do this. Let's
Oh,
open
that's
it.
the-
That's the tape deck. No,
There we go.
there we go.
Maybe, no?
Volume's up. And
Play button?
how about that?
Yeah.
There! Top 25 rock and roll favorites, everybody. According to your mail requests, your telegrams, and your record purchases is all over the rock and roll record kingdom. And we're going to get off and running to warm up with Red Tie Sock on Mercury. Rock and roll!
And that's the voice of Alan Freed, who was generally credited as being the first white DJ to play black R&B music on the radio, first in Cleveland, later in New York. Actually, as I discovered in writing this book, he was preceded by several years by a DJ out in Southern California named Hunter Hancock, who starting back in about 1947, started playing some of what were then called race records on the radio, and that was such a revolutionary thing to do that the first week he went on the air with this program, people by the hundreds came down to the radio station banging on the windows to hear more of this. And a couple of years later, after he'd become a big phenomenon in LA, Hancock made his first appearance on television. And when he did so, he'd been on the air for several years, and this is a guy who sounded whiter than white bread. But because of the music that he played, and because it was just such a revolutionary concept that a white DJ would play black artists, the first thing he did when the camera pulled in to show his face, he said, well, now you know what old Hunter Hancock looks like. And the whole crowd went bananas because everyone assumed that he was black. And this just gives you an idea of the role that radio played in the emotional lives of people at a moment when radio could provide a sense of surprise and a sense of serendipity, which is really what's missing from a lot of the digital music sources, where you have to go out and get it, therefore you know what you're looking for, and you're not nearly as likely to be surprised. Is there any way, how do you communicate to a generation that's grown up with iPods, with searching for and finding their own music and creating their own radio stations? How do you communicate to that audience the value in what radio offers, that sense of serendipity?
Well, I think the key is delivering it, first of all. I mean, right now, from a music standpoint, most terrestrial radio is completely soulless. It's the music selection is based on research, which is completely flawed. Because if the music research worked, there'd be no reason for internet or iPod or XM or Sirius, because everybody would be so satisfied. But the music research is just, here's how it works. Let's hear this great song. It really has potential to be huge. Radio stations will call people at dinner time, phone solicitation, and play them this new song and ask them to rate it 1 to 5. 1, I hate it. 5, oh, I love it. Or unfamiliar, never heard of it. Well, since it's never been on the air before, everybody says unfamiliar. It goes back to the program director who says, okay, this record, unfamiliar. We only play hits. End of conversation. The second thing is corruption. I mean, and you're starting to see it finally come to light, but top 40 radio, particularly over the years, has just been payoff city. I mean, it's been under the radar a little bit, and instead of getting Cadillacs and trips to Vegas, you get this promotional support. But thanks to Mr. Spitzer, that's coming around. And there's also the focus of the stations that this musical education, soul, having a spirit and attitude is not good. No, we're really, these stations are machines. They're hits. There's one Clear Channel at some of their stations introduced this thing where you can't talk more than 10 seconds, and how can you sell music that way? But so the first thing is they're not playing enough music to get behind it. We play the new Mariah Carey. What are you going to say about that? But there's also this, if it's not a hit, if it's not familiar, if it doesn't fit these categories and all this, don't play it. Whereas in 1970 and before, or 1980 and before, there was a real effort to, breaking songs, being first, getting the records first, talking about them, selling the music, being tied at the hip with music. Now that is just completely off the radar. It's a bad thing. Shut up and play the hits. At XM, and I'm serious too, we're trying to obviously get around that. But the first thing is you can't, radio has a thing about lying to people. If you listen to radio, the most music, no it's not. The best music, bullshit. It's all lies. And so the first thing you got to do is what we call AFDI, which means actually frigging doing it. Actually use a stronger word. But that means
But we wouldn't want to be fined for
but instead of talking about how great you are, cutting edge of rock and roll, it's all lies. You got to AFDI it on the air. So that's the first step. Then I think it'll take care of itself. People will get the word will get out, the word of mouth. That Esquire guy will be talking about the renaissance of rock radio and all that. So I think marketing it is a challenge, but useless exercise until it's actually delivered on the air. And right now on terrestrial radio, there's about, in contemporary music, out of the, whatever we have, 11,000 or so stations in America, there's probably about 4 or 5 commercial stations that actually do a good job at it. And but it's really, again, gets down to the eye off the creative ball and how it just doesn't matter. So
there is an argument that payola, while corrupt, actually played an important role in breaking new music, in getting new artists on the air, and that has been true throughout radio history.
Well, yeah, I think in the early days, everybody did it. I mean, you couldn't get a record on it. I'm talking about the 50s, early 60s, and it was just tradition. One of the lines was, "There's no bread in this sandwich." When a guy would bring a record, there's no $50 bill in the sleeve. But in the last 10 years or 15 years, the people who are it's not payola, but legal payola types, are the big giant record companies, the Sonys, the BMGs, and the Universals. And the little guy, which used to be like Roulette Records, and they're just completely cut out. They don't have the money to pay off all these tweak shows. So I think in the early days it was effective, but nowadays it's...
Can we get an endorsement of payola from a federal communications agency? Creative power of payola?
There's one thing I've fought is payola at the FCC, so not for me, but I could explain why it doesn't work that way anymore a little bit from what I've done. We've conducted a major investigation based on the Spitzer documents, and it resulted in some of the largest fines in the history of the FCC, which we recently announced in a settlement with the big radio broadcasters, and we're still looking at the little ones because it appeared to be endemic. And the change was now it's being done in email, so you can actually read all about it, and we can actually see who's getting the money and who's getting paid off are Good Charlotte and bands that are already making it. I mean, kind of pappy bands. Who'd you mention? Mariah Carey.
Yeah.
Actually, bands that you don't think needs it aren't being broken, but they're making sure they get more and more play so they can push record sales. The new artists, as a matter of fact, almost by definition, the young, new, exciting, dynamic artists don't get payola because it's corporatized now, and they put the money behind the artists that already are going to be almost a sure bet to get them even more play. So it was depriving local artists of airtime because so much of the airtime was being dominated by big national artists with a lot of money and the big labels behind them that a little local artist even had a harder time of getting heard. It was already very difficult. But today, when you think about the research, I mean, I actually am a research victim. I was, before I got in the Commissioner Arbitron family, and so they call me all the time. This is the one people I never hang up on. I always listen to them. But one of the things they do, they only give you 5 or 10 seconds to hear the new song.
Right.
So if it doesn't have a catch, it doesn't have something that's familiar with what you've already heard, it's not going to be of interest to you because it sounds new. Now, if you go back to 1957 or 56, 55, and you test Elvis, he's going to tank. What the hell is this? What are you disturbing my dinner hour with this jangly thing I've never heard before? It's awful. I give it a 1 out of 5. Right? So the new Elvis can't get heard anymore because he doesn't have a big label backing him. He sounds different, which goes against the whole research. Anything new and creative that isn't homogenized, genericized, banana republicized, McDonaldized, whatever you want to call it, isn't going to break. And so the soul of music is sapped by payola, it's sapped by the research methods, it's sapped by concentration and consolidation, where they put the same thing on nationwide, and it's sapped by the inability of local artists to get heard as a result of all that, which also is the strength of radio. So if somehow they could get back to that, having local shows, having local talent, that's something that, again, XM Sirius can't do because they're doing national programming and they're not going to do local artists in Tallahassee or even Memphis. So payola, I think, has been very detrimental to radio.
Well, I've kind of stacked the deck here in having a panel where everyone's going to pounce on Clear Channel. So, I mean, the Clear Channel argument would be that they have this new format lab where they're creating all kinds of new formats. They're trying to do a lot of different things, and they would say that they're the victim more of changing technology than of a lack of imagination. And they would say that the marketplace has changed, that you can no longer do mass audience programming, that everything has to be niched because that's the nature of the American advertising industry. Advertisers want to reach a particular demographic slice of the population, and therefore have to create formats that appeal to one particular group. What's wrong with their perspective?
Well, the first thing that's wrong with their perspective is not working. There was a great frou-for-all, and I'll just add that the anti-competitive aspects of their consolidation were never lost on them in terms of how they tied these things together. And it wasn't just we're doing this because the advertisers want it. There were conscious efforts to, especially Clear Channel, which integrated its billboard business, its concert promotion, its radio. And if you look at the Spitzer documents, you can see that even the RIAA, the biggest labels, in fact, were among those who came forward who were not happy with the state of payola because Clear Channel had such a huge tie-in that you couldn't get your concerts promoted, you couldn't get, unless you bought these package deals. And that was one of the big ways in which this was getting done, was they said, yeah, well, we'll play you a little bit, but if you actually bought our billboard advertising and used our concert promotion service, next time you're coming to town, you'll see a lot more spins than you would if you are using somebody else's service on that. So, that wasn't all lost on them. I would say that, the other thing is that they really have to take a step back and see why people are finding these other technologies so compelling. It's not enough to say, kids these days just use the internet. Why? There's been a lot of technologies that have come along that people have adopted or not adopted. The VCR did not kill television. Internet video has not yet killed. Cable did not kill broadcast television, just the opposite. It was discovered that in a fragmented world, the ability to consolidate an audience, even if it wasn't as big as it used to be, was more valuable. So network upfronts actually went up. The money paid by advertisers for network ad programming actually went up in recent years because the cable audience is so fragmented that the ability to attract 20 million viewers in one place is huge. As compared to 15 years ago when 20 million viewers was a badly rated network program and people didn't want to see it. So it's not just a question of the technology has changed. It's really a question of people are leaving you if they have a choice because you're not giving them what they need. And my advice to these guys is have faith in your local audience again. Go out. People like to hear themselves. They like to hear the stuff that's going on, and look at what's being successful on internet video and internet radio. what's out there is not just the fragmented stuff. It's great. I can go live365.com and I can get the Celtic channel because I can only get 1 hour of Celtic music here in the United States and in my market, rather in Washington D.C. Not that I don't love Fiona Ritchie, but the ability to get that all the time coming at me and hear new groups and so on is really exciting. But more importantly, there are a lot of people who are doing stuff locally. I have seen in a lot of work I've been doing with the use of unlicensed radio waves, what we think of as Wi-Fi, that's being used to stream and deliver some of this stuff. There are communities where high schools are streaming their local football game, or where you have a little local radio station basically set up for people who are listening to it streaming over the internet that's talking about the stuff in the community, not just the big talk show. And that's the kind of thing that radio really needs to reconnect to and rediscover. And if you're talking about segmented markets and so forth, local advertisers and local segmenting, because again, one of the things that we think about is when you talk about what the advertisers go for, tends to be national advertising. The larger companies are all thinking of the national, the regionals, the big buys. Radio used to be the local commercial medium.
Dollar a holler.
Dollar, right? If you were going to find out about a local used car sale, if you were going to find out about the local paint store or whatever it was, they bought it on local radio because that's what was affordable and it was local and people listened to it for that. That's all changed because the conglomerates have been chasing the national ad buys, the big ad buys, and they need to start looking again at how to make this something that's accessible on a local level, not just the local music, but also the local ads.
Well, I spent a lot of time in this book talking about how we've lost this local connection and how radio had its greatest emotional impact as well as informational service by serving local communities. And that's something that has been very much lost as we've gone into this period where satellite technology made possible nationally popular talk show hosts as well as music programming. But if you look at how the internet has changed the popular culture, it really has diminished the role of geographic affinities and interests in favor of interest group affinities. And so when you look at satellite radio, that's an example of that. I mean, your whole model is based on the idea that localism is not as important as it once was, right?
Well, yeah, actually, I think, again, local radio has shot itself in the foot because it's been discussed, it's not local. We want to be local, but our locality is, Long Beach to Long Island, the whole country. Some of the things we try to do is engage America, because, again, local stations aren't engaging their community. So a couple of examples is Springsteen's first gig is in, let's say, Milwaukee. At the second that's over, our jocks will go on the air and try to get people who were at the show to be stringers. So, okay, we have Joe Schwartz calling from Milwaukee. Joe, how was the show? Oh, man, it was great. Best show ever. Live from Milwaukee. And when Katrina happened, we had, I think we had better coverage in the local stations. I remember, if anybody's in Louisiana, call us. And there was one guy who was like the Hindenburg disaster on the air. Yeah, I'm driving on I-10 right south of Baton Rouge. There's a big wall of black in front of me. I've never seen a storm like this before. So there's ways to engage America like local radio used to, just of course on a bigger scale. So I think it all gets down to just engaging the community, whatever your community is, and we want to take advantage of that. It's harder, but
is there a role? I mean, is there a role for the government in encouraging localism? Is that something that's important? Is there hope for that happening, given that the nature of programming and the economics of the industry lead virtually every size station, no matter what size the community, to do the same lineup of Rush and Laura Schlesinger and so on, because that's where the money is, and it's cheap for the local stations.
Well, localism has been at the heart of federal regulation from the very origins of radio, and I argue going back even further to the earliest stages of American media in the 18th century, and even before, believe it or not, into the 17th century. There's a great book on this, Creation of the American Media, by Paul Starr from Princeton. If you're really interested in this topic, it's essential reading, because it turns out the American Revolution was underpinned by local and free press that was commercially driven, which is the reason that we have a different model. It goes back to the very revolution. The revolutionaries identified with this. There was 5 newspapers in Boston in 1730, and that's a city of 15,000 people. These people took upon themselves to be their own printers. The revolutionaries identified with them. They identified the American spirit with this free press and with local press and with the commercial press. So fast forward 150 years to the creation of radio and the creation of the FCC. Unlike other countries, which did national broadcast licenses, in England you get the BBC nationwide license, in European countries, all these countries that, by contrast to America and the Star Book, had command and control media from the beginning. They had, the monarchy was controlling it, they controlled, they had national press, they didn't allow local press, particularly critical of the government or the monarchy. Here, we had that tradition. So it wasn't a question at the beginning of the American media. We went to local licensing. A radio station was licensed to serve local needs, local communities. And if they didn't go out and ascertain what was happening in the local community and respond, they'd have trouble getting their license renewed. They actually had to prove they were serving the local community. And all that's been lost in terms of federal regulation, but the American tradition is still the same one. The Americans expect, demand, and love and breathe localism. They want a local press. They want a vibrant local discussion. They want a lot of diversity of voices in a sort of a town hall. But they've lost that in radio. They look to the internet for it. They don't always find where they want to be. I think that, contrast to what you're saying, that the future of radio, a lot of it will be in localism. That their distinguishing characteristic from a lot of these other mediums is the fact that they can communicate and broadcast locally. And if they don't honor that, then they're going to find themselves lost. And it's incumbent on us as the FCC, as they move to digital, for example, to try to encourage at a minimum some local content. That's where I think we could have a role as we're trying to put public interest obligations on digital broadcasters. When they get new opportunities, they get 3 channels in the place of 1, maybe they had to use those extra channels to do something that's actually serving the local community as their license requires them to do.
I want to open this up to the audience in a minute, but let me just first get quick answers from you, if I could, on there seems to be a contradiction between this sort of stultified state of music radio, and yet on the AM band in talk radio, we see one big controversy after another about all kinds of scandals involving pushing the envelope and trying to, and you know, not necessarily in an uplifting manner, but or an educational manner, but at least pushing the standards and questioning what really is allowed to be said on the radio. And you can call that creative or not, but is there right now with the IMAS situation and the other scandals we've seen of late, does that indicate any sign of life in radio, or is this a death spasm of some sort? And where are we in terms of coming to any kind of consensus as a country about what broadcast standards ought to be?
You know what I mean? I guess I'm the standard guy. We have fairly limited ability to regulate because of the First Amendment. We look to indecency, which the courts have allowed us to regulate. But I think it's more a sign of death throes than anything else. It's as consolidation occurs, these companies are chasing the bottom line ahead of all else, and they're looking for the lowest common denominator. They're not trying to uplift, but they're seeing what can attract people in ways that are not necessarily healthy or not necessarily uplifting, as you said, which might lead to longer term audience participation. I'm probably going on too long, but it's like McDonaldization of media. If you eat McDonald's, it's pretty damn tasty, you know, it's good, but if you eat it all the time, you get sick. And that's what's happened with radio. And everybody's trying to produce the same McDonald's stuff. Difference is on radio, you can't set up another health food store next door. There's only so much room on the dial. Everybody chases it. The whole genre gets driven down, and eventually people just stay away from it. They consider it like fast food, and they have a sort of bad feeling in their stomach about it.
Yeah, I'll just, I want to add to that very quickly that, yeah, this is not creativity. This is, there's a perception, there's been a perception that to get the highest paid, the audience for which you'll get the highest return from the advertiser, the tweens, the 20s something, that the grosser the better, the more outrageous the better. And that's not creativity. I mean, that's not taking risks, that's not developing new formats, that's seeing that somebody named Howard Stern a while ago developed something that when he did it, you know, arguably it was creative to try to bring this in. 100 imitators is not created. Mm-hmm. Rush Limbaugh in 1992 providing a particular kind of talk, maybe, you know, that's creative to put that out there. 100 imitators is not creative. That's just, corporate researchers looking and saying, oh, this stuff, it seems to be selling this month. It generates a particular audience. We can, take it to the bank, and that's just what we're going to do, and we're going to ignore real creativity, real experimentation, trying to find out what we should be doing, and just chase what somebody else came up with first as much as possible and run it into the ground.
XM is kind of playing both ends here, because on the music side, you're emphasizing creativity and adventurous kind of programming, and yet on the talk side, it's if broadcast radio has gone to the lowest common denominator, I mean, you guys are doing stuff that's way beyond what the broadcasters do as far as, the language that you hear on some of the XM talk shows is pretty startling, even compared to cable TV, isn't it?
On some of them, yeah. I mean, they are noted XL, so you don't have to listen if you don't want. But I think the whole that whole thing is just part of the whole media infatuation with junk culture, which is like pop culture's sick, evil cousin. This whole Paris Hilton and, Imus, all this stuff. It's just such crap, and it will go away because it's going to reach the enough already factor where it doesn't work anymore. But XM, we have to appeal to as many people as possible, and part of that is, the Opie and Anthony crowd. But we have Bob Edwards and we have BBC too. So, but personally, I can live without it.
And the advantage of an XM is if I'm an XM subscriber, I can go from the highs to the lows. If I'm a terrestrial listener right now and every radio station in my listening area is chasing the bottom, as Commissioner Adelstein said, I don't have a choice.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I completely, I agree completely with the vast wasteland that local radio has become, and it's obvious that some guy sitting in San Antonio voice tracking for all over the country. Going to take a slight difference of opinion with what the commissioner said with regards to XM. Now, I have an email relationship with Lee, but I'm sure he doesn't know who I am off the top,
So you're the one.
Okay. Now with 7 million plus subscribers, I can write to Lee, and I get a response the same exact day. Now, the difference between local radio and what Lee can do is he's got a bank of 3 or 4 million records to choose from. And for someone who grew up on WABC radio, where Rick Sklar said 40 songs, and WNEW FM, which they put the needle down and let the record play from end to end, depending on what mood I'm in, I can listen to the entire genre. And on a 70s station, I call them the holy yes moments, where I'll hear a song that I haven't heard in 30 years on his 70s channel. Like, I didn't even know the Carpenters did a version of calling Occupants of Interplanetary Earth, which was by Cletu, who everyone thought was the Beatles. It is amazing the variety that an XM offers. And no, it's not local, but the variety is just so intense. And I can get a response from Lee or a response from one of his jocks. And that's something that would not happen with a Clear Channel station, I'm sure.
Yeah, corporate radio has certainly moved away from that kind of intimacy and that kind of connection with the audience, which is really mainly what radio had to offer. I mean, radio, although we've sort of lost track of this, but radio is and can once again be the cheapest medium in popular culture, and you guys have managed to do it at great expense, but it's something in theory at least you could do with one guy in a studio.
Yeah, although if I can just address that for 1 minute, nothing wrong with that. XM. I'm glad they're out there. I'm glad Sirius is out there. I'm not going to say whether I think I'm going to be glad if they're both together or not, but that's one form of diversity. And that's an important form of diversity, and it's particularly important with terrestrial radio falling on the ground. But even there, it's still one company, XM, deciding which 200 formats it's going to fill. And if you're looking to who's going to come up with really great ideas that are on the ground here that relate to the kind of formats that start real small and then expand and grow all over the country, I think that nobody's better suited to do that than local radio.
Yes.
I find it curious that the word National Public Radio has not yet emerged. So a couple of questions. What kind of multiplier effect does that have on local stations? Whenever I travel, I always search the FM for an NPR, and I'm happy. And of course, often they're run by college stations, so you get some local color and local features. And they do attract a certain demographic, no question about that. But I'm curious if you guys think it's going to grow over time and have a good contagion effect. And again, the whole issue of the smaller stations. At one point, I knew something about community radio. There is a National Association of Community Radio Stations. I don't know how they're doing. And of course, there's Pacifica and on and on. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about where you see NPR going. I assume we will have a different party in control in the next series of presidential election. And maybe there will be more money, and the fights of defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and so on will diminish. But where do you see our support for public radio going?
It's actually, their audience, as you may know, has increased dramatically. And I think it's, I was on the tip of my tongue, I should have mentioned it so I could, but the reason is that this McDonaldization effect. It's sort of like a high-end steakhouse over here, and there's just one of them, and you got all this McDonald's stuff. So a lot of people have abandoned the commercial side, and that's the only place they can go for high-end, intelligent, balanced programming. I think its success is a direct reflection of the problems in commercial radio, and perhaps there needs to be a way that we channel more resources to public radio because of the failure. I mean, one of the proposals has been, if we're going to license broadcasters in the public interest, and they're not going to serve the public interest, which they don't anymore because we don't require them to, why not just charge them a fee for use of the airwaves and take the money and use it to fund public broadcasting so people have a choice and the public interest side is served here, and let commercial stations be commercial and chase the bottom line.
You know, public radio, I don't know if Lee would agree with this, but public radio was an early pioneer in setting the model for moving away from localism to the idea that one national stream of programming could really attract an audience. And that actually is the, I think, the dangerous aspect of what public radio has evolved into, in that the original idea behind public radio, that it would be a salvation for all of these minority forms of music and other programming that would never be supported in commercial radio. And so in the early decades of public radio, the average station would have 15 or 20 different formats. All within 1 week, you would hear classical and jazz and bluegrass and academic lectures and poetry readings and all this stuff that never would have a prayer in commercial radio. And that's been lost in part because of the funding battles in the 1980s, and public radio stations were forced to become much more commercial in their thinking and in their business model, and the result is that news and talk programming pulls in far more in the way of listener donations than any of the other programming ever did, and so all that other stuff has been forced out, and what you end up with is hundreds of college and other community-owned stations across the country that are just pipelines for the NPR national programming. John?
We talk about segmenting and niche programming, but one of the things we haven't really addressed at all here, and I'm a bit surprised by it, is, we touched on it a little bit, but race. And the fact that we start with a white DJ playing black music, and then we get to a point where I remember, it was a number of years ago, there was a radio station, and their tagline was the best of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and no rap. Which is code for no black music.
Right.
And I think that reflects something perhaps larger in the culture, and I'm wondering if your panelists could touch on that.
There's no place in the American culture that is more segregated than radio than perhaps church. But those two are the last places where there's almost official segregation. And I mean, radio stations, when you approach them, whenever in the course of my reporting, whenever I talk to program directors and ask them, what is your station, what is your format, they will almost always define themselves by race. They'll say, well, we're 90% white and suburban and women 21 to whatever it is. And it's just sort of taken for granted.
Yeah, this is a very serious problem, especially in the last 15 years. We used to have policies that encouraged minority ownership by women-owned stations, on the rather intuitive idea that ownership of stations matters in terms of how you think about your programming, the kinds of things you're going to be looking at, what community you feel you're serving. That has been pushed back by deregulation and by a number of unfortunate court decisions, which have made it very difficult to be conscious of the question of ownership in that way. I've heard a lot of complaints from fellow activists in the hip-hop community that hip-hop has been hijacked, that what started out as a music that belonged to people in African-American communities and other communities has been hijacked by these white corporate conglomerates who play only the worst of what is out there, and that is in fact targeted towards white audiences. And so not only has their own music been stolen and their own voice been stolen, but it reinforces all of the negative stereotypes that they find detestable. We have pushed hard to try to get the FCC to move back to tracking and considering minority ownership. Unfortunately, the current chairman is extraordinarily resistant he's got the Stephen Colbert thing. I don't see color. And as a consequence, while there's been a lot of good research actually about this, in fact, Commissioner Adelstein can tell you, he was at a free press event just this past week where there was another study released about the terrible state of media ownership of radio outlets in this country. It's very difficult in the current FCC to have the agency even begin to focus on that issue.
Yes.
I'd like to begin. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentations. They are very interesting. I appreciate your time here.
Could you speak up a little, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking you all for your time here. Your presentations are very interesting to me, and I'm sure to other members of the audience here. I'd like to begin by asking, can an individual citizen today, in today's terrestrial radio, what's the word, the scenario or the situation we have, get out a public service announcement to these radios just by calling them and saying, I have this message I want to get, and it's for the community? That's to begin.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. If it's particularly if it's a well-produced piece, yeah. And I know we do, particularly early on before we had, because we have ads on our non-music channels. We would encourage people to send us public service.
There's been a decline. I mean, this is one of the areas where we touched on. Commissioner Adelstein touched on public interest obligations, and I often feel that this is a place where regulation is actually to the benefit of the industry, because if everybody has to follow the same rules, then people will all follow them. If you remove the rules and you tell people, oh, just do what you think is best, then even people who want to be good actors and who think it's to their long-term advantage are stuck following everybody else and pursuing the bottom line. But we've seen that the nature of the public service announcements that go out tend to be, number one, they're pushed off to times that are less commercially desirable. So, yeah, they do PSAs, and they do them at 11 p.m., and they do them at 6 a.m., and they don't do them nearly as much in the prime time drive time. When they do PSAs, a number of times it's a matter of focusing on some of the more national stuff, and it's harder for non-recognized groups to get their PSAs out there. There are still radio stations that do good work with local charities, but again, part of the problem is you get what I call the lottery winner problem. The local radio station picks one charity. WTOP picks Boys and Girls Club, and that's fine if you have a lot of radio stations, each one working with local groups. But where you only have one or two stations that are willing to even do that, then it just becomes, who's the lucky group that's selected rather than a real service that's provided throughout the community.
Yes.
Well, could I actually follow up on that?
Well, let's give some other folks a chance.
Okay.
Yes.
I came in a bit late, so I'm not sure if you folks touched on radio journalism beforehand, but I'm curious to know what types of career advice would you have for a young person who's interested in radio journalism?
It's a dying breed.
Well, unfortunately,
That's important advice too.
it is. Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer stations that do news in any substantial way. What you've found, certainly in commercial radio in the last decade or so, is that most stations have outsourced news to one of two companies that provide news headlines, traffic, and weather from some remote studio. And here in Washington, the same company provides news headlines and traffic reports to almost every station in town, and the same announcers will use different names on different stations so that you don't catch on to that. That's unfortunately the state of radio news. Obviously, National Public Radio is an exception to that. They have a lot of new funding that has allowed them to dramatically increase their number of foreign bureaus and national reporting correspondents. So that's about the only place I can point to where there's any growth in radio journalism.
I would just add, one of the big problems for radio journalism is that what used to be kind of the farm league, the starter positions, all of these things have disappeared. And because we don't have a lot of local radio news anymore, which is where a lot of people would get their start and then kind of graduate up. Audio, blogging, and that kind of internet radio is a place to start. It doesn't take the place of journalism. It's not really journalism yet, but if you're looking to these questions of where do you go to actually start and where do you go to start making a name for yourself, right now the internet is the only game in town. It's not nearly the same thing, but at least it's a place to begin.
And actually, most of the really creative audio reporting that's being done now is not being done on radio. It's being done on the websites of major newspapers, which are moving heavily into multimedia. And whether it's audio or video, those are the positions that most big newspapers are hiring in the most. Is because of the idea that those websites are going to have to be more than just words. Yes?
I have two parts to my question. One, I think that from my perspective, there's confusion in the marketplace. And I happen to be writing a book, and I called XM Radio, or XM, and I said, I don't understand all these different diverse terminals. And you were so kind, your vice president PR showed me around, and that's when I discovered that XM is a content company. And you have all these different stations in the basement of this warehouse, and it's just phenomenal. But I don't think the public necessarily understands, first of all the diverse array of terminals, and the fact that you truly are this mega content company where you are doing all this there. Maybe everyone else understands it, it's only me.
Does XM eventually get to a point where the satellite technology doesn't matter and you're just producing?
Oh, that's been, there's big friendly fights internally about it. Are we a hardware company? Are we a device company? Are we a content company? And I think finally we're realizing as a company that it's all about the content of it. It's not this hardware thing. Oh, and you also get all these channels. But it's a major challenge, but I agree with you, and I think that's where we're headed.
And as the commission looks at the whole XM Sirius merger question, are you going to get into this question of who their competition is and whether they are just a content company versus a satellite radio company?
Well, we have to define the market as we do with any merger. I can't get into a lot of detail about it, but the big question is, does Sirius compete with iPods? I don't see how iPods are any different than CDs. I mean, I used to be able to pop a CD and I could switch one out and put a new one in just to say it was a little bit more work, but it's the same thing. 8-track tapes, what's any different? I mean, so what is the competition is a very good question, and we're going to have to define the market. Certainly, XM competes with terrestrial radio. That's a very similar market, and they go back and forth, but they also compete with each other, and the big question for regulators is to what's the real competition. But I don't think anybody's going to go to the place that they've asked us to, which is that they compete with the
world.
With the world. Otherwise, what about the guy whistling down the street?
Yes.
Getting back to the music and color, I'm showing my age. What about the era of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Nat Cole? They were played. We don't just like the music. It didn't matter, the color. Now, why is there this division now? Whereas in my era, there wasn't, for the most part. I mean, at least we can didn't have it.
A lot of the biggest artists on white radio are black. I mean, what do you call white radio? Or white radio is dominated, but think about Michael Jackson. I mean, everybody listens to him, whatever color he might be. You could go on and on about all the artists that cross over, but you're talking more about a genre of urban music that also crosses over. I mean, a lot of people listen to that. It's geared to a certain audience, and the question is who owns it and how's it programmed, what kind of sensitivity. But I think there's probably as much listening race sort of neutral. I mean,
That's
as
what I
it can
mean,
be.
it was neutral then, but now there doesn't seem to be that neutrality.
I actually think it's more neutral now, I would argue.
Yeah.
Well, it can be more neutral. It depends. I mean, if you look at the ratings numbers on who listens to which stations, it's sometimes surprising how mixed a station's audience might be, and sometimes surprising how one-sided it can be. But I think what's more important from the radio company's perspective is who the advertiser is going after. And so stations will very often try to skew their appeal to reach one race or another, or one demographic group or another. And often that may not reflect who's really listening, but in the warped conversation that takes place between the advertiser and the radio station, it's like neither one of them wants to know the truth. They just want to hear what they want to hear. Yes.
Right. Going back again to the point of NPR, yeah, it's always been so interesting watching the evolution of its funding. It was really struggling at the beginning, and I think the money from Joan Kroc made a huge difference, and yet their quality, in my opinion, continues to be good and constantly improving. Given the fact that also from the public there's an increasing amount of funding going for National Public Radio, and you all have spoken about imitations of success, I wonder if on XM radio or other stations there are some ideas for taking more content from NPR, that type of station, and doing more imitations, because one reason I listen to NPR is, in my opinion, there ain't anything that comes even close to
There's a tremendous interest in the industry because especially in some of the more affluent markets in the country, such as Washington, the ratings for public radio stations are at the very top of the local market, or within, certainly in the top 3 or 5 stations. And so what you're seeing is, my own newspaper's radio station was an attempt to create something that was a little more highbrow than the headline service on WTOP, but quicker and more commercial sounding than what you would get on public radio. It hasn't exactly succeeded by any means, but that was the driving idea behind it. And I thought that satellite radio would move more in that direction than it has, but I assume it's the expense of...
Well, yeah, we admire NPR tremendously, and when we launched, we wanted to bring them on as their own channel. They wanted so much money. It was like Howard Stern money. We said no. So we hired Bob Edwards and created XMPR, which is our NPR type station. But I think if you listen to XM, a lot of our channels are really modeled after NPR's in the tone and in intellect and integrity and quality. So we look up to them. And again, we'd love to have them, but they want so much money. It's just crazy.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yes, go ahead.
Talking about newness and creativity, on XM I noticed that there are a lot of channels like me. I listen to Lucy and Ethel, and those are, for those who don't know, are the sort of 90s and alternative stations. And I find that there are a lot of stations, even on FM radio, that are 80s, 90s, and today 90s stations, 80s, 70s, classic rock. And you'll find that the classic rock stations only play Earth, Wind and Fire, Allman Brothers, and the Doobie Brothers, or something like that. And even with WETA, it's really the Mozart 5 hours, and maybe a Brahms thrown in sometimes. I don't know. That's what I've
gotten better.
It's gotten better.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
But just in terms of newness, do you think there's this sort of trend of nostalgia, and I know XM radio tries to work within those to create more new situations. But
yeah, I think Certainly, we have a lot of channels like XMU that are, as soon as it becomes popular, it goes to another channel because it's not new and amazing anymore. But I think, throughout history, the music people like between 16 and 20 tends to be kind of what you like for life. Before 16, you're into whoever's cool or cute that week. Those are kind of the musical formative years. So, and again, there are exceptions to that. But there will always be people who want to hear sort of the music they grew up with. So I think the nostalgia thing is important. But I think it needs to be balanced with the current thing. A lot of FM stations have done is kind of just blown off the whole current thing. It's too unfamiliar. It's too much work, to go out there and find out what's going on. Let's just play the big testing hits. But I think the new music thing, like we discussed earlier, is part of the whole radio equation that iPod can't touch, nobody can touch. The fact that radio is a place to discover music and get turned on to it. So I think it's critically important. I think the old stuff is, and what's important with the old stuff is a little sort of slogan. It's playing careers and not just the hits. Because I did a graph once that showed the Beatles recorded like 325 songs. Radio played 8 of them. It was a big pie graph. And I think that's the key with a lot of the older artists, is really playing the career, not just those 1 or 2 songs. But equally important is, the discovering the new artists. So I think it's critical, at least at XM and Sirius probably too. But at FM, I don't think they really care.
Yes.
Sure. Nobody's mentioned, you mentioned NPR, but there's also a station here called WPFW. I don't know if anybody's mentioned it. Pacifica, right, which is part of the Pacifica family. And I listen to everything. I too own an iPod, and I'm actually a sound engineer. I own a recording studio. And we're always, when guys come in or ladies come in to record, it's almost like, oh, that's great. What do we do with this music? Now that we've recorded it, we got this great product. And of course, half the stations, I also used to work for Kathy Hughes. I don't know if you guys know. She owns half of Black Radio, more than half. And I would have conversations with her, and she was always on what works. She has a TV station out, and she would say things like, I would say, I watched Good Times come on like 10 times today. And she's like, well, it works. And I go, wow. Anyway, so, that's what, you're faced with. As an engineer, as a musician, we're discouraged. I mentioned PFW because no matter what station, where I am, I can always come back to PFW, and it feels local. It's got a lot of information, and it runs a gamut on music and creativity. And they've even changed over the years, over the last 30 years. It's changed. It's gone less jazz, more news, and that works. And they try to figure out where they are in the whole thing with listener-sponsored radio shit. But that seems to be. It feels less and more of even hip hop, I feel like I'm bombarded by hip hop all over, and I listen to hip hop and stuff, but it seems like it's everywhere. It seems like it's everywhere and it's used. It seems like if it works and they can take it to the bank, they're going to continue. Nobody seems to care to step in and go, wait a minute, what about integrity? What about creativity? What about other things that matter? And you can look at that in every industry, clothes, movie, it's everywhere. And so if we go down that road, then we're doomed.
I'm not worried about terrorists. I'm worried about this junk culture thing.
There is this, there was this book last year, The Long Tail, which makes exactly the argument that there's a handful in many industries, if not most industries, there are a handful of businesses or stores or formats or whatever it is that dominate the market. Sure. And the more creative, innovative stuff at the far end of that long tail, up until now, it's been tough for that to break through. Right. And the theory in the book was that the internet makes it possible for all these little things at the far end of the tail to suddenly flourish and become available. It's not clear yet that that's really happening in radio. Pacifica's model, WPFW's model, is a 40, 50-year-old model that even most public radio stations have left behind.
Yeah, I'll just add 2 things on that. One is, in terms of rolling that back, one is a role of regulation in terms of breaking up the largest conglomerates, bringing back local and regional radio, creating new ownership opportunities for new people to take chances. We think, Media Access Project, I can say this has been a big issue of ours, is that one of the things that creates the kind of echo chamber effect that you're talking about is when you have only a handful of companies that own the majority of stations and they're making the programming decisions, and a decision to go with, these are the groups we play on our contemporary adult station, echoes throughout the country. And so breaking that up is one of the things we consider to be most important. Creating new outlets like Low Power FM we think is also important. And the last thing that I'll just throw out there is, in terms of things like the internet that folks are looking for, part of it is defining what the success is going to mean. And if your measure of success is, I'm going to have all of the money that stars in the current media system have now, because I'm going to be able to replace them through